Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 17th of July 2020 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Now, before we start today's analysis, there is a small announcement for you. We have recently released two Prelims Compass magazine on the Amazon website. These two Prelims Compass magazine are the magazine on budget and economic survey and the magazine rated to the international organizations. So those of you who would want to have access to the hard copies of these two Prelims Compass magazine, you can go ahead and order them on the Amazon website. The Amazon link for these two Prelims Compass magazine has been provided in the description box below for your benefit. Now the first article appears on page number 1 and is titled as Rebel Rajasthan MLAs Move High Court Against the Speaker's Notices. Now this particular article has appeared in the context of the recent application of the anti-defection law to the rebel Rajasthan MLAs. Hence, this particular article shall be important mainly from the perspective of GS Paper 2 under the subsection Polity and Governance. Apart from that, this particular article is also important because in UPSC Mains 2013, there was a direct question related to the anti-defection law. Similarly, even in prelims also question has been asked with respect to the anti-defection. Now, based upon the discussion that we are going to have, a mains question for your practice here could be, do you think the various interpretations of the Supreme Court on the exercise of powers by the Speaker to decide on the anti-defection have reduced the scope of misuse and ensured its effective implementation? Give arguments in support of your answer. I hope all of you must be aware about the recent political drama which is unfolding in the state of Rajasthan. Rajasthan's Deputy Chief Minister Mr. Sachin Pilot, accompanied by around 18 rebel Congress MLAs, has openly criticized the policies of the Indian National Congress. In response, the party had issued whip to these rebel MLAs in order to attend the legislature party meeting. However, in spite of the whip which was issued by the political party, these rebel MLAs failed to attend the meeting. Now, as you all must be aware, under the 10th schedule which deals with the anti-defection law, the MPs and MLAs are required to abide by the whip which is issued by the political party. If they fail to abide by the party whip, then they can be disqualified by the Speaker. Accordingly, since these rebel MLAs had failed to attend the Congress legislature party meeting, the Congress party had then recommended the Speaker to disqualify them under the anti-defection law. Accordingly, the Speaker of the Rajasthan State Legislative Assembly then issued a notice to these MLAs for their disqualification. Accordingly, now these rebel MLAs led by Mr. Sachin Pilot have approached the Rajasthan High Court challenging their disqualification under the anti-defection law. Now, the disqualification of these rebel Congress MLAs has in turn led to both legal and constitutional challenges to the anti-defection. Now, before we get into the ongoing debate related to the arguments and counter-arguments put forth by the concerned parties with respect to the application of anti-defection, let us understand the provisions of anti-defection law as well as various Supreme Court judgments related to the anti-defection. Now, these aspects of the article I have already covered in the DNS dated 23rd of Jan 2020. So accordingly, what I would do here is I would attach the previous video dealing with the basic aspects about the anti-defection as well as Supreme Court interpretation on the anti-defection law. Once we cover these aspects, we'll come back and understand the ongoing debate. Now, the anti-defection law was not originally included under the Indian Constitution. However, it was subsequently added to the Indian Constitution through the 52nd Amendment. And such an anti-defection law has been basically provided so as to provide for the disqualification of the members of parliament as well as the state legislatures on the grounds of defection from one political party to another. Now, with respect to the deciding authority for the anti-defection, the Indian Constitution states that any question regarding the disqualification arising out of defection is to be decided by the presiding officer of the House. Now, as to on what grounds can a member be disqualified under the anti-defection law, a member can be disqualified under multiple reasons. For instance, if a member voluntarily gives up the membership of his political party, and secondly, if any political party issues a whip to its member, and if any member votes or abstains from voting contrary to the whip which has been issued by the political party without obtaining the prior permission, then such member can be disqualified. Thirdly, if any independent candidate joins the political party after the elections, then such an independent candidate can be disqualified under the anti-defection law. And lastly, if any nominated member of the House joins a political party after 6 months after the elections. So please note that an independent candidate stands disqualified under the anti-defection law if he joins any political party irrespective of the time frame. However, a nominated member of the House stands disqualified only when if he joins a political party after 6 months after the elections. Now, there are certain exceptions to the anti-defection law as well. The first exception has been provided for the merger of political parties. So, whenever two political parties merge, and if at least two-thirds of the members of a political party join with another political party, then these two-thirds of the members cannot be disqualified under the anti-defection law. Now, for example, let's say there are two political parties, Party A and Party B, and if two-thirds members of the political party A join the political party B, then these two-thirds of the members cannot be considered to be disqualified under the anti-defection law. And secondly, as discussed before, if a member voluntarily gives up the membership of a political party, then he can be disqualified under the anti-defection law. However, this particular provision is not applicable to the Speaker of the House, wherein the Speaker of the House is allowed to give up the membership of the political party. Now, such an exemption has been provided in order to ensure the dignity and impartiality of the Speaker of the House. Now, the Indian Constitution is silent on some of the important provisions of the anti-defection law. For instance, the Indian Constitution clearly does not state as to whether there is a time limit on the Speaker to decide on the anti-defection law. Similarly, the Indian Constitution clearly does not state as to what does it mean by voluntarily giving up the membership of the political party. Similarly, the Indian Constitution is silent as to whether the courts issue the directions to the Speaker to decide on the anti-defection. Hence, in order to bring about a greater amount of clarity with respect to some of the provisions of anti-defection law, and in order to ensure its effective implementation, the Supreme Court has given interpretations on some of these provisions. For instance, the anti-defection law says that if the member of parliament or the member of state legislature voluntarily gives up the membership of the political party, then such a member shall be disqualified. But the question here is, what do you mean by voluntarily giving up the membership of the political party? The Indian Constitution is silent on this particular aspect. Hence, in order to bring about clarity with respect to voluntarily giving up the membership, the Supreme Court has stated that voluntarily giving up membership would mean a member has voluntarily resigned from the political party from where he has contested the elections. Now, even in absence of voluntary resignation of a member can even be disqualified looking at the conduct. Now, for instance, if an MP or an MLA is involved in public criticism of one's own political party, that is, the MP or MLA is using the public platform to criticize the policies of his political party, and at the same time such a MP or a MLA is giving open support for the opposition party, then this means that the MP or a MLA has switched his political loyalties. Hence, accordingly, even in the absence of voluntary resignation of such a MLA or a MP, such a MLA or a MP can be disqualified under the anti-defection. So please note that voluntarily giving up the membership does not necessarily mean the resignation, but it also means the conduct of the member. Secondly, initially the Indian Constitution stated that the decision of the Speaker with respect to anti-defection is final and it cannot be questioned before any court of law. However, in a famous case known as the Kyoto Holohan case in the year 1993, the Supreme Court stated that the decision of the Speaker is subject to judicial review, since the judicial review happens to be the basic structure of the Indian Constitution. So presently, whatever decisions are taken by the Speaker, these decisions can be examined or reviewed by the courts. Thirdly, as stated before, presently under the Indian Constitution, there is no time limit imposed for the Speaker to decide on the anti-defection. However, as stated in the recent case known as the Meghachandra Singh case that we have discussed recently, the Supreme Court stated that the Speaker would have a time limit of 3 months to decide on the anti-defection. With respect to issuance of directions by the courts to Speaker to decide on the anti-defection, as stated before earlier in the Rajendra Singh case in the year 2007, the Supreme Court had ruled that the courts can issue the directions to the Speaker to decide on the anti-defection if the Speaker is unduly making a delay in making such decisions. So these are some of the important aspects which were. Now coming to the ongoing debate over the application of the anti-defection, the Congress party has argued that it had issued the party whip to the rebel Congress MLAs in order to attend the Congress party legislature meeting. However, in spite of the party whip, these rebel Congress MLAs had failed to attend the meeting, and accordingly, since they had violated the party whip, they stand to be disqualified under the anti-defection. On the other hand, the rebel Congress MLAs have counter-argued that the party whip as such is applicable only inside the state legislature. And since the Rajasthan state legislature is presently not in session, they are not under any obligation to obey the party whip. Apart from that, the rebel Congress MLAs have also counter-argued that the party whip as such can be issued in order to ensure the presence of the MLAs inside the state legislature. The party whip can also be issued in order to ensure that the MLAs vote along the party lines. However, in this particular case, the Congress party had issued the party whip in order to attend the party meeting, and hence the anti-defection law as such cannot be made applicable here. Secondly, the Congress party has argued that the rebel Congress MLAs have given a number of press statements that have openly criticized the policies of the Indian National Congress, and such open criticism of the Indian National Congress can be and such open criticism of the political party can be inferred as a kind of voluntary resignation by the MLAs. So because of certain inference of voluntary resignation of such rebel Congress MLAs, they stand to be disqualified under the anti-defection. Now for this particular argument put forth by the Congress party, the rebel Congress MLAs have stated that first and foremost, they have never expressed their desire or intention of quitting or resigning from the political party. They have never expressed their intention or desire of aligning with the opposition party. So this cannot be construed or inferred as a voluntary resignation. They have also gone on to say that a mere expression of disagreement with the policies of the political parties cannot be construed as a defection under this particular law. The Congress party has also taken the support of the previous Supreme Court judgments on the anti-defection, and accordingly it has stated that the conduct and the behavior of the rebel Congress MLAs was akin to a voluntary resignation from the political party, and hence they should be disqualified under the anti-defection. However, for this particular argument, the Congress MLAs have stated that they have merely expressed their disagreement with the policies of the Indian National Congress, and that cannot be construed as the defection. And hence, if they are disqualified from the political party, it will hurt their freedom of speech and expression, and this would also lead to the imposition of the majoritarian view or the view of the political party on the views and opinions of the individual MPs and MLAs. Hence, in the name of party discipline, the anti-defection hurts their freedom of speech and expression and prevents them from criticizing the policies of their political party. So right now, this is an ongoing debate, and presently the matter is before the Rajasthan High Court, which is yet to deliver its verdict. So this particular news as such is a news in transition. So let us wait and watch as to what would be the outcome or the judgment of the Rajasthan High Court on this particular issue. As and when the Rajasthan High Court delivers its verdict, we shall take up this particular issue once again. Now the next article appears on page number 1. The title of the article is India registers a steep decline in the maternal mortality ratio. As you all must be aware, the Office of Registrar General under the Ministry of Home Affairs is entrusted with the responsibility of conducting the population census. Now, apart from conducting the population census, the Office of Registrar General also monitors the implementation of the Registration of Births and Deaths Act in India. Accordingly, recently, the Office of Registrar General has come out with a special bulletin which highlights the maternal mortality in India. And as per this special bulletin, the maternal mortality ratio in case of India has registered a steep decline. Now, as per the World Health Organization, if a woman dies either during the pregnancy or within 42 days of the termination of the pregnancy, then it would be considered as a maternal mortality. So please do note here that even when a woman dies within 42 days after the termination of the pregnancy, even then it is considered as a maternal mortality. Now, in order to measure the maternal mortality, we have two indicators. The first indicator is the maternal mortality ratio and the maternal mortality rate. Even though these two terms are used interchangeably, but as per the World Health Organization, there is a difference between these two terms. When you look at the most commonly used term, that is the maternal mortality ratio, it is referred to as the number of maternal deaths per 1 lakh live births. So the formula here would be the maternal deaths would be in the numerator and the number of live births would be in the denominator. So this is how the maternal mortality ratio is being calculated. On similar lines, when we are calculating the infant mortality ratio, we would take into account the number of infant deaths per 1000 live births. So in case of IMR, we are taking into account 1000 live births, but in case of MMR, we are taking into account 1 lakh live births. On the other hand, when it comes to the second term, that is the maternal mortality rate, it is defined as the number of maternal deaths per 1 lakh women in the reproductive age group of 15 to 49 years. So here the formula would be the number of maternal deaths divided by the number of women in the reproductive age group of 15 to 49. So if you look at the difference between the first term and the second term here, the numerator in these both the cases is same. However, in the first case, that is the case of the maternal mortality ratio, the denominator is the number of live births, whereas in case of the maternal mortality rate, the denominator is the number of women in the reproductive age group of 15 to 49 years. Now, in its special bulletin published by the Office of Registrar General, the report has highlighted that the maternal mortality ratio in India has seen a steep decline from 130 in the years 2014 to 2016 to 113 in the years 2016 to 2018. Now, among the different states in India, Kerala has the lowest MMR of 43, while Assam has the highest MMR of 215. As far as the overall maternal mortality rate in case of India is concerned, it is 7.3. So, while the maternal mortality ratio is 113, the maternal mortality rate is 7.3. Further, please do note that the Sustainable Development Goal 3.1 aims to reduce the global maternal mortality ratio to less than 70 per 1 lakh live births. Now, the Economic Survey 2015-16 had incorporated a separate chapter titled as Mother and Child. In this particular chapter, the Economic Survey had analyzed the reasons for the higher infant mortality rate and the maternal mortality rate in India, and accordingly it had given a number of suggestions for the government of India in order to reduce the IMR and MMR. See, we all know that the nutrition status of the mother in turn determines the health and nutrition status of the child. If the mother is well nourished, then undoubtedly she'll give birth to a healthy baby. On the other hand, if the mother herself is undernourished, then she would not be able to give birth to a healthy baby. So, if the baby or the child who is born has poor nutrition status, then this in turn affects the overall cognitive and physical development of the child. This is so because the rapid cognitive and physical development of the child takes place when the child is inside the womb of the mother. So when the child is inside the womb of a mother, the child gets all the nutrition from the mother, and the child is not able to get proper amount of nutrition, then this would have an adverse impact on the cognitive and physical development of the child. Now, unfortunately, in case of India, the nutrition status of the adolescent girls or the future mothers as such is quite poorer. This in turn has adversely affected the cognitive as well as physical development of the children. So the poor nutrition status in the children is in turn manifested in the form of underweight, stuntedness, and poor educational outcomes. Now the poor educational outcomes is because of the poor cognitive development of the child when it was inside the womb of the mother. Now so far we are trying to address the problem of nutrition at this particular level. That is when the malnutrition has already occurred. Now for example, we are trying to improve the nutrition through the ICDS scheme or the midday meal scheme or so on. But if you look at the root cause of the malnutrition as such, the root cause of the malnutrition lies in the poor nutrition status of the mother. So in a way, the malnutrition in case of India actually starts in uterus. So since the root cause of the malnutrition in case of India is a poor nutrition status of the mothers, the economic survey has highlighted that the government has to focus upon the early life or early pregnancy interventions. Now, for example, it has recommended that the government could possibly focus more amount of investment on improving the overall nutrition status of the adolescent girls. So, if the nutrition status of the adolescent girls improve, automatically they will be in a position to give birth to the healthy babies. So the poor nutrition status of the young girls on account of socio-economic reasons has led to their undernourishment. For example, as per the economic survey, 42% of the adolescent girls are undernourished. Moreover, the adolescent girls in case of India have low weight as compared to the global standards. Apart from that, when women as such become pregnant, the amount of weight gained during the pregnancy is quite lower as compared to global standards. For example, as per the WHO, a pregnant woman should gain a weight of 12.5 kgs. However, in case of India, a woman gains an average weight of only around 7 kgs. So as you can see here, the women in case of India have low weight both before the pregnancy as well as during the pregnancy. So this form of undernourishment of the women in turn affects the cognitive as well as physical development of the child. It leads to the malnutrition in the children. That is, the malnutrition actually starts from the uterus, and this also increases the risk of the death of the child as well as mother. Now, in order to reduce IMR as well as MMR in case of India, the government of India has launched a number of schemes. Some of these schemes are Janani Suraksha Yojana, Janani Sishu Suraksha Yojana, Mission Indradhanush, Mother's Absolute Affection, ICDS, Pradhan Mantri Matru Vandana Yojana, and so on. Now, this particular table has been incorporated in the PDF for your reference. I hope you will be able to go through this particular table on your own and remember the important schemes as well as objectives. Apart from that, the contents of this particular chapter, that is a chapter of mother and child, which was incorporated in the economic survey 2015-16, they are quite important with respect to the mains examination as well. Now you can use a number of points from this particular chapter in order to write an answer in the mains related to the improvement in the health status of the women and children. Accordingly, the link to this particular chapter from the economic survey has been incorporated in the description box below for your reference. Now this particular article appears on page number 8 and highlights that the government of Karnataka is set to raise around 8,000 crore loan through the issuance of the state development loans. The article that we are going to discuss here shall be important mainly with respect to prelims under the subsection Indian economy. Now this particular article is quite important because recently in prelims 2018 there was a question related to the various financial instruments issued by both the central government as well as the state government in order to borrow the loans from the market. Accordingly, let us understand as to what are the various sources of borrowing for both the central government as well as the state government. Now, as you all must be aware, the fiscal deficit corresponds to the total amount of borrowings by the government in a single year. The fiscal deficit is usually expressed in terms of percentage of GDP. Now, for example, for the present financial year, the government has estimated the fiscal deficit to be at 3.5% of India's GDP. Now, considering the fact that the nominal GDP of India in the financial year 2019-20 was approximately equal to, so if you convert 3.5% of the India's GDP, that is 204 lakh crore, into absolute value, it would be almost around 8 lakh crore. So 8 lakh crore is what the government has planned to borrow for the present financial year. However, we all know that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the government is not being able to meet the borrowing targets and it is required to borrow more amount of money in order to provide for a fiscal stimulus. Nevertheless, keeping this aside, let us understand as to what are the various sources of borrowing for the government of India. So as you can see here, the government can borrow both long-term loans as well as short-term loans. With respect to short-term loans, one of the most dominant source for raising the short-term loans is through the issuance of the treasury bills. Now, through the issuance of treasury bill, the government can borrow the short-term loans from the market. Now, the maturity period of the treasury bill is of different periods such as 91 days, 182 days, 364 days. So depending upon the maturity period of the treasury bill, we can have three different types of T-bills, that is T91, T182 or T364. Now please do note that these treasury bills are actually zero coupon securities. That means they do not carry any interest. They are usually issued at discount, but they are redeemed at face value. Let us understand this mechanism through a simple example. Let's say the face value of a particular treasury bill is rupees 100 and you have bought this particular treasury bill at a discount value of rupees 97. So you have not bought the treasury bill at its face value, but you have bought it at its discounted value of rupees 97. So upon the maturity of such a treasury bill, you would be getting back a value which is equal to the face value of the treasury bill. So for you, the profit here is rupees 3. So this rupees 3 in a way can be considered to be a kind of interest on the treasury bill. However, as stated before, the treasury bills do not carry any interest and hence they are referred to as zero coupon securities. So whenever the government needs to borrow money from the market for a duration of greater than 91 days but less than 1 year, then the government can issue the treasury bill. The next financial instrument that the government can resort to is the ways and means advances. Now under the ways and means advances, the government can borrow money from the Reserve Bank of India. So unlike the treasury bill where the government is borrowing money from the market, under the ways and means advances, the government is borrowing money from the Reserve Bank of India. That is the first difference. The second difference here is the government can resort to ways and means advances from the Reserve Bank of India only to meet its temporary mismatches in its cash balances. So the government cannot resort to ways and means advances in order to finance its deficit. Now recently the Reserve Bank of India has increased the borrowing limit of both the center and states under the ways and means advances in order to deal with the COVID-19 situation. Accordingly, this particular topic of ways and means advances becomes important for your upcoming prelims examination as well. So let us understand in detail about the ways and means advances as well. Now, as stated before, the ways and means advances can be resorted to both center as well as states in order to address their temporary mismatches in receipts and expenditure. Now, for example, let's say in the month of June, the government is said to receive an amount of rupees 200, but it is required to spend an amount which is equal to rupees 300. So here, the government is having a shortage of rupees 100. Now let's say in the month of July, the government is said to receive an additional amount of rupees 100. So here for the month of June, the government is facing a temporary mismatch in its receipt and expenditure, and it cannot keep on waiting until the month of July in order to undertake an expenditure of rupees 300. So in order to address this particular shortage of rupees 100, the government can resort to borrowing from the Reserve Bank of India through the ways and means advances. Now, the ways and means advances was actually introduced in the year 1997. Before the ways and means advances, the center and states used to issue the ad hoc treasury bills. Now, the problem with the ad hoc treasury bills was that the interest rate on the treasury bills was quite lower as compared to the existing repo rate. So, since the center and states were required to pay a lower rate of interest on the ad hoc treasury bills, they kept on issuing the ad hoc treasury bills in order to not only meet their temporary mismatch in their receipts and expenditure, but they also use the ad hoc treasury bills for undertaking their deficit financing as well. So the temporary nature of ad hoc treasury bills as such became both permanent as well as cumulative, and in the long run this led to financial indiscipline on the behalf of center and states. Hence, in order to address this particular problem, the ways and means advances was introduced in the year 1997. So under the present regime, the center and states can resort to ways and means advances only to address their temporary mismatches in the receipt and expenditure. They cannot resort to ways and means advances in order to finance their deficit. Now, for example, let's say the overall revenue receipts of the central government is around 1000 rupees, whereas the revenue expenditure is around rupees 1500. So here the government is having a deficit of rupees 500. Now this deficit of rupees 500 cannot be financed through the ways and means advances. The ways and means advances as such can be used only to address the temporary mismatches. So under the ways and means advances, both the center and states borrow from the RBI, but there is a limit on how much amount of money can be borrowed, and this particular limit is mutually decided by both the Reserve Bank of India and the concerned government. The interest rate on the ways and means advances is equal to the repo rate, and the duration as such is 90 days. So after the duration of 90 days, the center and the states will be required to return back the money which they have borrowed from the Reserve Bank of India under the ways and means advances. Apart from that, the center and state can also resort to overdraft. That means they can borrow over and above the limit which has been specified by the RBI and the government. However, if they are exceeding the limit specified by the RBI, then they would have to pay interest which is at least 2% higher than the repo rate. Next, coming to cash management bills. Now, the cash management bills can be issued by the government in order to borrow money in order to address their temporary mismatches in their cash balances. So similar to ways and means advances, the cash management bills can be used in order to address a temporary mismatch. However, the difference here is that under the ways and means advances, the government is borrowing money from the Reserve Bank of India. However, under the cash management bill, the government is borrowing money from the market. Usually, the maturity period of the cash management bills is less than 90 days. So as you can see here, the cash management bills have certain features which are similar to treasury bills and certain features which are similar to ways and means advances. So just like ways and means advances, the cash management bills are issued in order to address the temporary mismatches. And similar to the treasury bills, the cash management bills are issued in the market. However, the minimum maturity period of the treasury bills is 91 days. But the maturity period of the cash management bill is less than 91 days. So please do remember two important things about the cash management bills. The first thing is that they are issued in order to address the temporary mismatches in the cash balances similar to the ways and means advances, but unlike the ways and means advances wherein the government is borrowing money from the RBI, under the cash management bill the government is borrowing money from the market. The second feature here is, unlike the treasury bill whose maturity period is 91 days and above, the maturity period of the cash management bill is less than 90 days. As far as the long-term borrowings of the government is concerned, the government can borrow long-term loans through the issuance of the dated securities. The second one is securities against the National Small Savings Fund, special government securities such as recapitalization bonds, sovereign gold bonds, etc. The external borrowings, the receipts under the public account such as the State Provident Fund, etc. Now, as far as securities against the National Small Savings Fund, recapitalization bonds, external borrowings, etc. are concerned, all of these have been already explained in detail in our economic survey video analysis. Hence, we shall not be discussing these topics once again. I would advise you to go to the economic survey to have an understanding about these topics. Now, as far as the recapitalization bonds is concerned, through the recapitalization bonds, the government is borrowing money from the banks in order to undertake the recapitalization of the public sector banks. Now, as per the government, the money borrowed under recapitalization bonds would not be considered as part of fiscal deficit. Rather, it will be considered as part of the public debt of Government of India. Please note such a distinction, and this has already been explained in the economic survey video as well. Now, in case of India, the central government can resort to both short-term loans as well as the long-term loans. The short-term loans can be raised to the issuance of the treasury bills as well as the cash management bills. As far as the long-term loans is concerned, they can resort to the issuance of the dated securities. However, the state governments as such, they cannot raise the short-term loans to the issuance of the treasury bills. They can raise the short-term loans only to the issuance of the cash management bills. And as far as the long-term loans is concerned, the long-term loans can be raised by the state government through the issuance of the state development loans. So the state development loans are the financial instruments issued by the state government in order to raise the long-term loans. Now, coming to the question that was asked in the prelims 2018, the question here was, consider the following statements. The Reserve Bank of India manages and services the Government of India securities, but not any state government securities. The statement which is given here is wrong. This is so because the Reserve Bank of India acts as a debt manager for both the central government as well as the state government. The second statement reads as the treasury bills are issued by the Government of India and there are no treasury bills issued by the state governments. The statement as we have discussed is correct. The third statement reads the treasury bills offer are issued at a discount from the par value. As we have discussed, even the statement which is given here is right, and accordingly the right answer here would be C, that is 2 and 3 only. The next article appears on page number 5 and is titled as Traders Upbeat Over the Resumption of Business with Afghanistan. Now, this particular article shall be important with respect to GS paper 2 under the subsection International Relations. Now, presently we have an agreement in place known as the Afghanistan-Pakistan Transit Trade Agreement. As part of this particular agreement, Afghanistan can use the Pakistani territory in order to export goods to India. However, on account of COVID-19 pandemic, Pakistan had decided to end such an indirect trade between Afghanistan and India. However, recently, Pakistan has given the go-ahead to Afghanistan to resume the indirect trade with India. So, in this regard, let us try to understand as to what exactly is the Afghanistan-Pakistan Transit Trade Agreement, how it benefits India, and what are the current issues. As you can see in this particular map, we have mainly 4 countries, that is Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan and India. As far as Afghanistan is concerned, Afghanistan is a landlocked country. Being a landlocked country, it does not have access to seaports in order to carry out the international trade. And we do all know that international trade is an important tool in order to promote the economic growth and development of any country. So if a particular country is landlocked, it can act as a serious detriment to its overall economic growth and development. Now, in order to solve this particular problem, Afghanistan and Pakistan had entered into a transit trade agreement way back in the year 1965. Under this particular agreement, Afghanistan was allowed to use Pakistani seaports such as Karachi in order to import duty-free goods into its territory. So Afghanistan used to import the goods at Karachi, and the goods were then transported through the Pakistani territory into Afghanistan. However, the 1965 agreement did not provide such reciprocal rights to Pakistan. That means Pakistan was not allowed to use the Afghan territory in order to export the goods to the other Central Asian countries. Now, later on in the year 2010, this transit trade agreement was expanded. Under the terms of this particular agreement, both Afghanistan as well as Pakistan could use each other's airports, ports as well as roads in order to carry out the transit trade. That means now Afghanistan can transport its goods to India through the Pakistan territory. Now, under this particular agreement, Afghanistan is exporting goods to India at the Wagah-Atari border, which is an integrated checkpost which has been created between India and Pakistan. So the Afghan trucks can travel across the Pakistani territory, they can reach Wagah border, and then they can export goods to India. So right now Afghanistan is mainly exporting fresh fruits as well as dry fruits at the Wagah-Atari border. But the question which arises here is, can these Afghan trucks carry back the Indian goods while traveling back to Afghanistan? Now, under this particular agreement, the Afghan trucks cannot carry Indian goods while returning back to Afghanistan. Now, Pakistan has refused to give permission for India to export its goods to Afghanistan through the Pakistani territory, because Pakistan believes that when the Afghan trucks carry back the Indian goods, there is a possibility that the Indian goods can enter into the black market in Pakistan, and thus it may have an adverse impact on the Pakistani economy. So on their return journey, the Afghan trucks as such are presently not allowed to carry back the Indian goods. However, if they wish to, then they can carry the Pakistani goods on their return journey. So what exactly are the benefits for India? First and foremost, this will promote greater amount of economic integration between India and Afghanistan by promoting more amount of bilateral trade. Secondly, it will provide us with access to the Afghan agricultural products such as the dry fruits and the fresh fruits. And lastly, a large number of traders in Punjab, particularly along the Wagah-Atari border, are dependent upon the trade with Afghanistan, and hence such trade with Afghanistan benefits the traders in Punjab. Now, as far as the issues are concerned, we must understand that this particular transit trade agreement between Pakistan and Afghanistan is completely dependent upon the nature of relationship between the two countries. In the past, whenever tensions between the two countries have escalated, Pakistan had decided to close its borders and prevented Afghanistan from exporting its goods to India. So this particular transit trade agreement is completely dependent upon the nature of relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and thus the indirect trade that is taking place through India and Afghanistan is actually unstable. Secondly, for the settlement of transactions between India and Pakistan for the bilateral trade, we need to have a strong banking contact between the two countries. However, since the banking contact between the two countries is quite poor as of now, the settlement of transactions is little difficult. And last and the most important issue here is, as stated before, presently under the terms of this particular agreement, India is not allowed to export its goods to Afghanistan through the Pakistani territory. So this can be considered to be one of the biggest hindrance to the improvement of the bilateral trade between India and Afghanistan. So this clearly shows that Pakistan is cleverly using its geographical location in order to prevent strengthening of the bilateral trade relationship between India and Afghanistan. Hence, in order to take away the Pakistani factor in the relationship with Afghanistan, India had planned to construct the Chabahar port in Iran, and this Chabahar port was supposed to be linked to the Zahedan railway line, which connects Iran with Afghanistan. So this Zahedan railway line then connected the Zaranj-Dilaram highway in Afghanistan. It is to be noted that this Zaranj-Dilaram highway has been constructed by India, and this highway is in turn connected to the Garland highway in Afghanistan. So India had planned to export its goods to Chabahar, and from Chabahar the goods were supposed to be taken through the railway line and then enter Afghanistan through the Indian constructed Dilaram Zaranj highway. But we all know that recently Iran has decided to cancel the project that was earlier awarded to India for the construction of the Zahedan railway line, and Iran as such has decided to construct the railway line on its own. So this cancellation of the Zahedan railway line is considered to be a huge setback for India's diplomacy. Let us now take up some of the important articles in today's newspaper that become important with respect to the prelims examination. The first article appears on page number 6 and is titled as For Equal Treatment. Now this particular article has appeared in the newspaper because recently Supreme Court of India has declared that even the persons with the disabilities are socially backward, and hence they are entitled to the same benefits of relaxation as enjoyed by the members of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe. Now the details related to Supreme Court judgment has been recently been covered in our DNS dated 13th of July 2020. Hence, we shall not be discussing this particular article once again. However, what we would do in this particular video analysis is we shall discuss important provisions of the Persons with Disabilities Act 2016, which becomes quite important with respect to the prelims examination. Now, the Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 replaced the erstwhile Persons with Disabilities Act 1995. India is a signatory to the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Hence, in accordance with such a convention, India was required to give effect to this convention. Accordingly, India then enacted the Persons with Disabilities Act 2016. Now, under this particular act, the definition of disability as such is an evolving and a dynamic concept. Now, the definition of disability under this particular act is considered to be evolving and dynamic because the central government has been empowered to add more types of disabilities. So the earlier act covered only around 7 types of disabilities, but now presently the Person with Disabilities Act cover around 21 types of disabilities, and as stated before, if the central government wants, it can add more types of disabilities. Now some of these disabilities that are recognized under the act include the speech or language disability, the victims of acid attack, intellectual disability, mental illness, autism, etc. Apart from this particular aspect, this act has also defined the persons with the benchmark disabilities. Now, the persons with the benchmark disabilities are those persons who are certified to have at least 40% of the disabilities. This particular act also provides for the reservation for the persons with the benchmark disabilities. The reservation in case of higher education should be at least 5% in the favor of the persons with the benchmark disabilities, at least 4% in case of government jobs, and at least 5% with respect to the reservation in allocation of land and poverty alleviation schemes. Apart from that, this particular act also provides that the persons with the benchmark disabilities in the age group 6 to 18 years shall be provided with the free education. The district court can also provide for the guardianship over the differently able people, but at the same time, it also provides for the joint decision-making power between the differently able and the guardian. In order to implement this particular act, it has established a number of authorities. For example, under this particular act, we have the central and state advisory boards on disability who act as the apex policy making bodies. Then we have the Chief Commissioner of Persons with Disabilities and the State Commissioner of Persons with Disabilities. Now the mandate of these two commissioners is to monitor the implementation of this particular act and also handle all the complaints related to the implementation of this act. With respect to funding, this act has provided for both national level and state level funds which would provide the necessary funding support to the people with the disabilities. And as far as the penalties for offences is concerned, this act has created separate courts in order to handle the violation of the law, and people who are found to be violating the provisions of this law can be punished with an imprisonment of up to 6 months or a fine of rupees 10,000. Or now these aspects of the Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 become quite important with respect to your prelims examination. Now coming to the second article, important from the prelims perspective, the next article is on page number 15. This article highlights that according to SEBI, the overall investment into the Indian capital market through the participatory notes or the offshore derivative instruments has increased to almost around 62,000 crores in the month of June. Accordingly, this article related to participatory notes becomes quite important because a direct question has been asked in prelims 2019. So let us understand as to what do you exactly mean by the participatory notes or the offshore derivative instruments. Presently, in case of India, the foreign portfolio investors can make an investment into the Indian capital market only after they get registered themselves with the SEBI. So once they register themselves with the SEBI, only then they can make an investment into the Indian capital market. Now presently we have three different categories of the foreign portfolio investors. Normally these foreign portfolio investors are the institutions based in other countries such as banks, insurance companies, mutual fund companies and so on. Apart from these FPIs, some of the foreign investors can also indirectly buy the shares, bonds and debentures which are issued within the capital market. The route through which these foreign investors can indirectly buy the financial instruments in case of India is referred to as the participatory notes or the offshore derivative instruments. Let us understand as to how this particular route works. Now let's say we have a foreign investor based in USA. Now what this foreign investor can basically do is he can take his money to a certain category of FPI in USA. Then he can ask the concerned FPI to make an investment in a particular share of an Indian company. So here the FPI that is based in USA is investing on the behalf of the foreign investor in the Indian capital market. But here the FPI as such is registered with the SEBI, but an investor is not registered. So here, since the FPI is making an investment into the Indian capital market on the behalf of this foreign investor, as an acknowledgement of such an investment to such foreign investor, the FPI would issue the participatory note. So as the name suggests, participatory note here would mean that the FPI is participating in the Indian capital market on the behalf of the foreign investor. Now, in the recent times, the participatory notes as such have become highly controversial. This is so because when the FPIs issues the participatory notes in order to invest in India's capital market, SEBI as a capital market regulator is well aware as to who is actually investing money. That is, which FPI is investing money in the Indian capital market. However, the SEBI is not sure about the source of funds of such an FPI because the FPI has resorted to the issuance of the participatory notes. So what can essentially happen to the participatory notes is that the black money which is lying outside India may make an entry back into India through the issuance of the participatory notes. So in a way, the black money lying outside India is getting converted into white money. So apprehensions have been raised that the participatory notes are a source of the money laundering. Now, if you look at the question that was asked in prelims 2019, it was a direct question and the answer here would be D. The next article appears on page number 3 and is titled as Sero Survey Result to Take at least a week more. National Center for Disease Control informs the High Court. Recently, National Center for Disease Control had carried out Sero Survey in Delhi. As part of such a Sero survey, the National Center for Disease Control had collected almost around 21,000 blood samples to check for the COVID-19 antibodies. The National Center for Disease Control was supposed to publish the results of such a survey, but there has been delay in the publication of such a result. In this regard, let us understand as to what do you exactly mean by the serological survey and its importance. See, whenever people get exposed to infection, the immune system in their bodies in turn develop the antibodies in order to fight the infection. So when a person is infected with the COVID-19 infection, then obviously the immune system in his body would develop the necessary antibodies to fight the infection. So what we are basically doing as part of the serosurveillance is we are collecting and testing the blood samples to check for the presence of antibodies. So if you come across the presence of antibodies in the blood sample of a particular person, then this would mean that such a person has got infected with COVID-19 and he could either be asymptomatic or symptomatic. The presence of antibodies would also tell us that such a person was infected with COVID-19 in the past, but he has developed the antibodies or he has developed immunity to fight the COVID-19 infection. So if we carry out the serosurveillance in a large community of people, and if we come across the presence of antibodies in large number of blood samples, then this would mean that a large number of people had been infected with COVID-19 in the past and they had developed antibodies or immunity to COVID-19. So the results of serosurveillance as such would benefit the policymakers as well as health experts in a number of ways. First and foremost, it is treated as a gold standard for measuring the immunity level within a population. It is used to measure the burden of infection at the community level. It can be used to monitor the trends in the transmission of a particular disease such as COVID-19. And this will also let us know whether the community transmission of a particular disease is it taking place or not. Now coming to the question for the day, the question here is, which among the following tools can be used by the central government for the short-term borrowing? The options which are given here are ways and means advances, cash management bills, treasury bills and dated securities. With respect to the question for the yesterday's DNS, the question was, consider the following countries. Which of the above countries are not part of the G7 grouping? Now the G7 grouping comprises of USA, UK, Canada, Germany, France, Italy and Japan. However, it does not include China, Australia and Russia. Accordingly, the right answer to this particular question would be B. That is 6, 7, 8 only.